Welcome to the Global Justice Report, an online production of the Center for Global Justice. I'm Cliff Durand, your host for today. The Center for Global Justice, La Justicia Global para El Centro para la Justicia Global, is a multinational and bilingual research center in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world and empowering a solidarity economy. We have a number of people who tuned in here in the Zoom room. I hope you'll mute your mics so that we don't get background noise. Due to the pandemic, we have discontinued our in-person events and instituted online webinars. Without our previous revenue-generating programs, we now depend on your donations to support these webinars and to be able to continue to pay our Mexican staff. You can donate at our website, www.globaljusticecenter.org. Revenue-generating programs, we now depend on your... Today's program is the 38th webinar we have done since we began these June 1. Today, we're pleased to have as our guest speaker, Steve Fraser, who's a prolific historian and creative historian. By that, I don't mean he creates the history, but he is a very creative writer. His writings are very engaging. He's chronicled the impact of wealth and power on American democracy. He's told the story of the rise and fall of the New Deal order, as well as the more recent rise of the right. His book, The Age of Acquiescence, The Life and Death of American Resistance to Organized Wealth and Power, is, to my mind, one of the best accounts of the militant resistance of workers during the Gilded Age and the contrasting acquiescence we see today. Although since January 6th, one wonders whether the acquiescence of the working class has ended in the wrong way. As the U.S. enters now a new political period with a Democratic White House and Congress, hopes are renewed for progressive change to address accumulated problems. Steve Fraser will share his insights on the prospects for an intellectual labor alliance today, drawing on his experience with such an effort 25 years ago. He will be recounting that experience and the lessons from it. What can be done at the leadership level depends heavily on how active and well-organized citizens are. Key among these are organized workers, labor organizers, and left intellectuals. A rejuvenated, progressive labor movement with class consciousness and solidarity at its core is central to progressive politics today, as it has been throughout much of our history. Well, I'm going to turn the floor over to Steve, and following his talk, we'll have a Q&A session, so you'll have an opportunity to raise your questions and to share comments with him. Okay, Steve, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Cliff, and thank you to the Center for inviting me to give this little talk. I'm particularly grateful to Cliff and the Center for allowing me to commit an act of self-indulgence, to talk about an event which I was personally involved in, and one which has been entirely forgotten. So it's a kind of double indulgence. This event is kind of a footnote to history. It didn't seem like that at the time, but now one would have to treat it as a footnote to history. And of course, historians love footnotes, but nobody else does. However, what I'm hoping today in talking about this event is to raise some questions of exactly the kind that Cliff just asked or suggested were important. This is an event which raises the question of what the relationship has been and might be between intellectuals and the labor movement, whether or not the labor movement does have to be a key to social transformation, as this event of 25 years ago presumed, whether the labor movement in fact can bear that burden, and whether or not today we see a revival of what used to be the central animating question of American public life, namely the labor question, or has it receded from public view? Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the event itself and to give you a feel for how shocking this was. I don't want to use the expression shock and awe, but now that I have, it was shock and awe when it happened, both for those of us who organized the event and for those who experienced it. It's just a teach-in, so why would I say it was so astonishing and shocking? Well, I think I have to set the stage a bit for you. This event happens as you could figure out, in 1996. It's the 90s. It's the high noon of neoliberal capitalism. Francis Fukuyama has just published his book, The End of History. It seems to be an accurate prediction of what's ahead. Liberal democracy and capitalism have triumphed, and that's the end of the story. Things may happen, according to Fukuyama, but nothing to change the basic storyline. It's a triumph of liberal capitalism in America and in the world eventually, according to him. This is a moment when, and yet it's strange that he would say that. Here we are, it's the mid-90s. Just around this time, Kevin Phillips, the Republican apostate who had invented the silent majority strategy for Richard Nixon years before, writes a book called The Politics of Rich and Poor. It comes out a couple of years before Fukuyama's book, and he says, America has become a tale of two cities. And he uses a phrase which we're very familiar with today, but which is a little newer then, that we're living through a second Gilded Age. So how could a country living through experiencing a tale of two cities, otherwise be so, on the surface, flat and without any sign of real protest? Here we have glaring inequalities of the distribution of wealth and income, not as great as today, but already sizable, huge differences. It's a country which has been devastated by deindustrialization. It's a country with massive homelessness. It's a country where the real wages of the working population have been falling for 20 years by 12% over the course of the previous 2 decades. It's a country in which the sweatshop, one people used to think had been extirpated from public life, has reappeared, reemerged as a major supplier of major retail outlets around the country. It's a country in which the population of the working poor numbers in the tens of millions. It's a country in which a whole middle strata of management has been surgically removed from the workplace. It's an America of Chainsaw Al Dunlop, of Scott Paper, or Neutron Jack Welch of GE, who are experts. They made their bones essentially disassembling industrial structures, auctioning them off, and amputating the workforce. And they're heroes. They're heroes because this is a country in which the market republic rules. It's Bill Clinton is our president, the great avatar of neoliberalism within the Democratic Party. He quickly, before his inaugural oath is done, he's shed what little populist aroma surrounded his campaign. Soon enough, we get workfare, the end of welfare as we know it. We get mass incarceration. We get deregulation of the financial marketplace. Under Clinton, it's a scene where the market republic is really predominant. And what makes things even worse is that there really is little sign of any protest. The labor movement is deeply on the defensive. It's been hemorrhaging members for years before 1996. there is what resistance remains there is trying to tread water. It's the era of concession bargaining, where you're lucky if you come out of a bargaining session only making minor concessions. Improvements are out of the question. The great social movements of the country's most recent past are fading into kind of oblivion. The civil rights movement, the feminist movement are gone. There's some activity on campuses within departments about racial and gender justice, but they're of a wider irrelevance to the country. They're relevant within those precincts, but more widely not so. So what you have is a situation in which the labor movement is almost comatose. The Black liberation movement is dead. The women's movement is dead. There's nothing really happening. I'm exaggerating. I know I'm exaggerating, but in perspective, that's what's happening in 1996. It's the triumph of that market republic, which is why the event I'm about now to describe to you is so shocking to everybody. It's a teach-in. Well, we've all heard a teach-in, just an ordinary old teach-in. What's the big deal? In 1995, something happened in the labor movement. There was a palace revolution. And for the first time, literally in 101 years, a opposition slate for the control of the American Federation of Labor won. They defeated the old guard. This hadn't happened in more than a century. For a century, it was treated like a fiefdom. The favored passed on their inheritance to the favored, and so on. But in 95, John Sweeney from the Service Employees International Union, the president of that union, Linda Chavez Thompson, the first woman and first Hispanic to be elected to a national office, and Richard Trumka, the head of the United Mine Workers, are elected. Sweeney as president, Trumka as secretary treasurer, and Linda Chavez Thompson as executive vice president. So this is the premise of the event, and it strikes some of us, me and some others, kind of left-wing academics as, gee, this is extraordinary and unusual. Let's see if we can do something about this. And two of us, I was one of them, wrote a little letter to the New York Review of Books, and we solicited signatures from famous intellectuals and writers. And the output of the willingness to sign that letter was already a premonition of things to come. It was extraordinary. Enormous number of people signed the letter, and across a broad range of political beliefs, from Arthur Schlesinger Jr. on the right to Barbara Ehrenreich on the left. Many, many names of people you would recognize instantly. It was published. And the AFL, Sweeney, the leadership was very grateful, and we began to talk to him about the possibility of a teach-in that would try to build an alliance between what now we saw was a kind of hunger on the part of the intellectual community, or some portion of it, for a movement that could really had the muscle, if it could grow, to effectuate social transformation. And so we planned this event at Columbia University in October of '96. Now, given that it was, after all, just a palace revolution, and that everything else I've said is basically true, there was not much happening, the expectations of the organizers were minimal. We would have been happy if 300 people had showed up, and delighted if 500 people had showed up. I mean, really had no more expectations than that. On the evening of October 3rd, 2,000 people showed up at Columbia. 1,000 people crammed into Low Library in the Rotunda. I don't know if you got people out there know Columbia anyway. It's a massive structure at the center of the campus. 1,000 people couldn't get in. The fire marshals had to close that building. We improvised and were able to establish other auditoriums with audio feeds and closed circuit television. Lines stretched from, well, you don't know the geography perhaps, but there were hundreds of yards long for people trying to get in. We set up loudspeakers outside. We were stunned. And the mood was a kind of mood of kind of stunned excitement in the hall. The event began that evening with the clerical workers of Barnard, who had just negotiated hard-fought contract with the university, marching in to a standing ovation. And then a series of speakers addressed the gathering. of considerable note. Betty Friedan began by talking about her historic Geiger counter that she said was ticking again as it had in 1963 when she published The Feminine Mystique. Richard Rorty, one of the country's foremost political philosophers, spoke next, and he talked about the long history of intellectuals siding with the labor movement and social movements generally. He was also booed because he blamed the new left of the 60s for fostering the break with the labor movement. And after all, this was a teaching, it wasn't a lecture, so he got booed because people disagreed with that. And I think he was a little one-sided in what he was saying. Then Patricia Williams, a distinguished critical race theorist and law professor at Columbia, and then became a famous Nation columnist, talked about the way the work ethic had been used to torment Americans, that John Henry was becoming the role model for Americans, according to the new administration. Then Sweeney spoke. And of course, there was a standing ovation. He's not an eloquent speaker, and he doesn't look the part of a rabble rouser. He's portly. He died, as you may know, a few months ago. He's rather portly and jowly and blue-eyed and kind of looks like it could be an Irish construction foreman at a construction site. But he was, no one knew it at the time, a member of DSA, although at those days, affiliation with DSA was so meaningless. It was inert, didn't matter. And he had led the SEIU just before this in a campaign that was called Justice for Janitors, which was one of the few bright spots in the AFL's resume in those days, organizing janitors around the country. Sweeney was known for blocking the bridges in Washington to stop traffic in order to support the janitor organizing campaign there. He was a militant. He spoke, he talked about how corporate welfare, Clinton's famous phrase was, welfare as we've known it is over with. Sweeney's comeback was, corporate welfare as we've known it is going to end. And he talked about the need. And what was most striking about Sweeney from the day they were alive, not just him, the leadership, is that they were committed to organizing the unorganized, the millions and millions of unorganized workers who had been essentially neglected by the labor movement for decades. Moreover, they presented themselves as open to all the movements for social justice, for racial justice, for gender justice, recognized their own limitations as a movement that no longer represented a changing workforce, was increasingly made up of people of color and women, vowed to end that, and even broke with the Cold War orthodoxy of the old George Meany AFL relationship. They had been warriors on behalf of the Cold War all around the world, and Sweeney pledged to stop that. So it was very exciting, and I think and that's part of what brought people out, what led people to sign that letter and to attend that evening. The next day was followed by a day-long series of workshops, again with all kinds of well-known speakers. I name a few of them for you. And every panel and every plenary session included both trade unionists, people of color, workers, and intellectuals and writers. So for example, Orlando Patterson, Katha Pollitt, Michael Eric Dyson, Herb Gans, Francis Fox Piven, Manning Marable, Barbara Ehrenreich, all among many others were speakers and participants in these workshops. The workshops covered a great range of issues, from organizing women to the role of class and identity politics, at which there were fierce debates. There were debates about other things, accusations laid at the feet of the labor movement, rightly, for being cold warriors in the past, for failing, as Francis Fox Piven argued, to defend the interests of the unemployed and the poor. Talk about various issues caused quite a bit of controversy, which was the idea, after all, of the teach-in. And there was a kind of electricity in the air. People felt it. Every workshop was overflow. The plenary sessions were standing room only. It was an extraordinary kind of event, and it was covered widely. Every metropolitan newspaper in the country had stories, one or more stories about it. The left-wing press naturally covered it, but places like the New Yorker, and in those days, I don't know if you guys will remember Lingua Franca, which was still around in those days, a kind of very intelligent, witty magazine of the academic world, covered it in several stories. It was covered abroad. El País in Madrid, German newspapers and Dutch magazines covered it. it was treated as a happening, as a kind of apparition from the past. And it felt that way to us, which is why we were so stunned. We weren't expecting it. We were expecting something much less. Now, so that's the event in broad outline. Let me see if I want to tell you anything else. Yeah, I think that is. I mean, Richard Trump ended the last plenary by saying that what America needs is a soul transplant. In other words, what the labor movement, this new leadership was saying was, yes, they were trade unionists, and in that sense, they were business unionists, trying to win the best contractual deals for their members. But they were also aspiring to be something more, a social movement, to talk so that, for instance, Sweeney wrote a book, which actually I was an editor in those days, I helped him do. And it was called America Needs a Raise. And that phrase was meant literally, because real wages had been falling for decades, but it was also meant metaphorically. That is to say that America needed to transform, and that the labor movement was, together with its allies, determined to do that. So we were very excited. And it was a kind of incarnation of our fondest historical hopes. We, the organizers, were a group of mainly white, mainly male, historians and others, not just historians, but there was a kind of disproportionate number of historians. It didn't really matter that much. Some of us were labor historians or other historians of America. All of us, whether we were historians or not, had in mind a kind of amorphous notion of what had existed in the past that we wanted to try to recreate in 1996, a history of an alliance. Now, what that meant to us, first of all, and of course, Rorty in his opening remarks talked about this, was that back in the 19th century, a whole roster of distinguished writers and artists identified individually with and wrote about working people. Everybody from Herman Melville to Theodore Dreiser, to Edward Bellamy, Henry George, William Dean Howells, Jacob Riis, a whole range of these people. And of course, some of them were very politically active. William Dean Howells played a major role in trying to prevent the execution of the Haymarket anarchists. Henry Demarest Lloyd, the great journalist of that era, led one of the antitrust movements of that period. But their connection to the labor movement was as individuals, supporting causes, but not as a collective, not as an institution. The first time that kind of happens is not long after that, during the heyday of what I would call the high noon of the labor question in American public life. And that is during the first decade of the 20th century. And it's then that Greenwich Village, that world of bohemian artists and writers and dancers and painters and poets and intellectuals, identifies with the labor movement, not of the sort that we might, not the Samuel Gompers AFL of that day, but more the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, all of that labor perturbation which promises to transform society, and sees in the labor question the ultimate question, the answer to all other questions about racial injustice and patriarchal repression, about sexual repression, about imperial war, everything for this world of left intellectuals, as well as left organizations like the IWW and so on, sees the labor question as the question. And so Greenwich Village organizes itself to do something about that. And it most famously does so in the two great wobbly mass strikes of that period, the Lawrence textile strike and the Patterson silk worker strike in 1912 and 13. And in the case of the Patterson strike, it organized a great pageant at Madison Square Garden and reenacts the events of the strike in order to build public support. That's the idea, that intellectuals and writers and artists will coalesce and build public support for a labor movement which promises to transform America. And they do this very successfully, but the strikes are killed. They lose. And that's kind of they do it in a few other events, but that's that. The next, and it doesn't take any ongoing institutional form. The first time it really does is thanks to the Communist Party. The Communist Party in 1929 establishes the John Reed clubs. Of course, Reed and Max Eastman and Emma Goldman were people who had been part of that Greenwich Village world, which had done all this organizing for the Lawrence and Patterson strike. So, of course, Reed dies in 1920, and the John Reed clubs are formed by the Communist Party. And the idea of the Reed clubs is to actually create an ongoing institutional manifestation of intellectuals and artists and writers who they think of as creative proletarians, that is, creative workers who need to identify with other and coalesce with other kinds of workers. And these clubs are very sectarian. This is the most sectarian period of the Communist Party's life. It's the third period. It's dual unionism and so on. And art is the clubs announced that art is a weapon in the class struggle. So you can get a sense of the narrowness of vision, but they succeed to some limited degree. They attract some of the most distinguished artists of the time: John Dos Passos, William Gropper, Richard Wright, and a number of others. They form schools for dance and music and other things. They put on plays, exhibitions, and so on. But they remain narrow and like the party itself, confined to a kind of sectarian niche. Then the next great period, and the period which those of us who organized the event most closely identified with or thought of as a model, is the Popular Front New Deal era. And of course, everything changes there. Before one even gets any institutional manifestation of this intellectual alliance, what you get is a sea change in the sensibility of the country. One historian has called it a plebeian sensibility. Suddenly, the proletarian everyman is the hero of the culture. And this affects every aspect of culture, from high culture to mid culture to popular culture to folk culture, whatever other cultures there are, is infused with this plebeian sensibility, whether it's in the movies or in cartoons, in dance performances, in the theater, Clifford Odets, etc., in mural paintings. It suffuses everyday life. And so there, and of course identifies closely with the reforms of the New Deal era and with the Roosevelt government. And it's that plebeian sensibility that the organizers of the event are thinking of when they organize this teach-in. There are two institutional manifestations that are created during that New Deal period of this alliance. One is called the National Citizens Political Action Committee, which really is not so much an intellectual alliance as it is just prominent citizens. And they're functionally an arm of the Roosevelt campaign, and so on. The one that comes closer is something called the Independent Citizens Committee of the Arts, Sciences, and Professions. And it is, as its name suggests, supposed to be an organization of us, of us intellectuals and artists and so on. And it is. It lasts briefly, but it is enormous. To give you an idea of how saturated the culture is in this kind of plebeian world, how identified people were with the CIO and the labor upsurge, let me read to you the board of directors of, I can't even pronounce the acronym, the ICAASP. Anyway, Olivia de Havilland, Albert Einstein, Van Wyck Brooks, Duke Ellington, Linus Pauling, Thomas Mann, Lillian Hellman, Carl Van Doren, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. People like Betty Davis and Frank Sinatra are appearing at their events. Ronald Reagan does as well, so does Groucho. In other words, it's a kind of pervasive cultural persuasion that enlists these kinds of people. And it is independent. It is independent in this sense. It is a child of the CIO. There's no question that it's the CIO, and in particular, the most radical, or let me put it this way, the communist elements within the CIO that are most behind creating this organization. But it does have its own independence, and it does stuff. It writes, it peers, it provides public speakers, in support of the New Deal and against Truman in his early years when he is anti-labor and pursuing the Cold War and so on. And then it vanishes into the Wallace campaign of 1948 and is never heard from again. And that's the end of it. But this was the kind of models we had in mind. And then we're shocked. We're standing there and there's 2,000 people and we can't believe it. we had thought a little bit about, we weren't idiots, about forming some kind of organization afterwards. And now the wind was at our back, and we did that. And we formed something, maybe 100, 150 people gathered in AFL headquarters about 4 or 5 months later, and formed what was called Scholars, Artists, and Writers for Social Justice. It became fondly known because of its acronym as SAUSAGE. And SAUSAGE was supposed to be exactly that kind of alliance. It was independent of the AFL. We met with them, but nobody from the AFL was on played no official role or any role. We liaised with AFL people about campaigns, and we tried to do a bunch of stuff. We really did. We worked very, very hard. There were 2 other teach-ins, one at George Washington University in 1998, another one at Yale in 1999. The one at George Washington was chaired by Julian Bond. It was a teaching on the right to organize, which was a major AFL and SAUSAGE campaign at that time to enlist public support. Here we are, nothing's changed. Anyway, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but the right to organize was the theme of that teach-in. And then the one at Yale was actually done jointly with GSO, that is to say the Graduate Student Union campaign at Yale, and the Yale unions of clerical and maintenance workers, all of whom marched through the Yale campus before the teach-in, and it was addressed by people like, Barbara Ehrenreich and Alec Baldwin and blah, blah, blah. And these teach-ins were decently attended, but not in the numbers that Columbia had been. And we launched a bunch of campaigns, the right to organize. We became involved in what soon became a nationwide movement, United Students Against Sweatshops. We formed a little speakers bureau. We published a book of essays from the original teaching called Audacious Democracy. But increasingly, it became clearer and clearer that it was a thin organization with no real base. We were a hard-working coordinating committee with less and less to coordinate. I would say at its apex, maybe there were 600 dues-paying members, and there was, a lot of sympathy. But what we began to realize that it was one thing to get a bunch of intellectual illuminati to show up at an event, which was not easy, but we could do it, and quite another to establish a permanent organization. It was really hard to establish chapters, which we tried to do and failed to do. And so by 2000, essentially, SAUSAGE was dead. And that whole notion of this alliance had come effectively to an end. So the question that naturally occurs to anybody is why? And the first place to look is internally. We should always look internally. And if you look at SAUSAGE, there were, as there had been at the teach-in, ongoing friction over class and identity politics. And I think everybody who participated in SAUSAGE in those days would agree, although there were these frictions, they were not serious and never interfered with the carrying out of any of our campaigns. There was a failure to recognize how difficult it would be to establish ongoing chapters, no matter what we tried to do, because, and this gets to the more deep question, because that plebeian sensibility didn't exist. It had died a long time ago. And we knew that, and yet we didn't reckon fully with the significance of that. If you look at the AFL, there were internal reasons there too. Not all the unions federated agreed with Sweeney. And they weren't about to pony up 30% of their dues to fund mass organizing campaigns. They were traditional business unionists. If they weren't corrupt, some of them were corrupt. But even if they weren't, they were basically serving their members, and that was it. Some of them, of course, still in their separate affiliations, remain closed to people of color or to women or discriminated against them. So they didn't buy in entirely to the Sweeney big vision. So these are internal reasons that shackled the AFL. The key thing is that we had all, I don't know if Sweeney had, we had misjudged the historical moment. That is to say, we had this vision, very amorphous one, of what had happened in the past and thought we could recreate it. But without that kind of plebeian sensibility already in place, it would be difficult. It was very difficult. It depended on one thing that is so obvious. which everything that happened in the 30s depended on. It depended on a actual, vigorous, growing, militant labor movement. And instead, despite Sweeney's best intentions, the opposite was happening. Even during that first year of Sweeney's election in '96, the organization continued to hemorrhage members. It staunched that for a while, and then the decline resumed. And obviously, you could criticize Sweeney and his Confederates for not doing this or doing this not well with some of the federated unions, but really it was a kind of tidal drift of this neoliberal economy that was very hard to resist. After all, we're living through a period where the words that are now common to us were first being invented: outsourcing, downsizing, lean and mean management. All of this this was the Geist. This was what was informing neoliberal global capitalism, and it included a frontal assault on the labor movement in every conceivable way, from the eviscerating the National Labor Relations Act. Reagan began it, as we all know, with the air traffic controller strike. It had continued from there. The NLRB was increasingly staffed with people unfriendly to labor, and on and on and on and on. There was a whole ideological attack on the labor movement. After all, this is a moment where public intellectuals, which used to be public intellectuals of the left, were now people like Fukuyama or George Gilder. So there was little dissent from that orthodoxy, little opposition in the public realm. And so sausage could not, if the labor movement couldn't flourish, neither could sausage. Its whole existence depended on that, and that didn't happen. So in conclusion, what I would suggest is this, that questions really. Can progressives and leftists who are interested in labor, and I think there are far fewer of those than there used to be, think and hope that the labor movement has in the past and can once again become something more than an engine of collective bargaining, even effective collective bargaining, even militant collective bargaining, that it can produce that it can become an engine of social transformation. And the question is that viable? Does that work? Has it worked in the past? Apparently during the CIO it did. Can it work again? And is it too great a burden? Is it a function? Is it a consequence of one variant of American exceptionalism? We have no labor party, and people write endlessly about why we don't have one, and never have had one really. But because we've had no labor party to represent the general interest of the working people, we've loaded that burden onto the labor movement, whether it's strong or weak, and it's not constituted really to do that. It may at times, when the wind is at its back, make steps in that direction, but it is, after all, not a political party. It is not a socialist party. It's not a labor party. So that's one question. And the question I think also that we need to ask us is if we're looking at today and whether these questions are relevant today, is that intellectual world anything like what it once was? After all, it was already underway then. There was a real proletarianization of academic life already underway in the 1990s. Well, it's far more advanced today. And although a lot of young people identify with resistance and movements, they don't identify that way. They identify that way as very, very anxious, worried young workers about to enter a academic marketplace which is dreadful and exploitative and without defenses. And maybe that's the grounds for an alliance, but it's a different set of conditions in a context that's different. And I think also we have to ask ourselves, I think one thing that's happened, the labor question died a long, slow, not death, it's not dead, obviously, but a kind of recession, a kind of receding into the background. It did so during the long reign and still the long reign of the market republic. And today, I would say it's replaced by the equality question. And the question I have, I think everybody needs to wrestle with, is whether there's a kinship between the equality question and the labor question, but they're not the same question. They are different, and they may lead in different directions, or they don't have to. So I think we need to reckon with that, and whether or not there can be a new intellectual labor alliance I'm not sure of. We failed to do that in Sausage. I once, this is just a personal note, and then I'll stop. I'm sorry to have gone on so long. I used to, I'm a big tennis player, and I watch tennis all the time. And I was watching the Australian Open some years ago, and that Swiss player who's not Federer, Wawrinka, was actually winning. He was about to win the Australian Open. And he had inscribed on his arm a tattoo. Wasn't a tattoo, it was a saying. And the saying apparently came from Brecht. Don't ask me why. And the saying went something like this: you try again, you don't work, you fail, blah, blah. The point is to fail better. I always like that saying. And the point might be, Cornel West, who was the final speaker at the opening plenary, spoke eloquently, as he always does, about an audacious democracy. And he said he didn't know if the labor movement was the key to social transformation. It wasn't a panacea, but it was important. And he said, we may fail, but we have to go down fighting. So I'll stop there.
Okay, Steve.
Yeah.
Well, you've given us a lot to chew on here. I think people probably have questions or comments that they want to raise with you. I should explain that some people are watching this on YouTube, and since they cannot present questions directly, if you are on YouTube, you need to send an email with your question. Send it to global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. I'll monitor that, and as questions come in, I will relay them to Steve. Those who are in the Zoom room with us can ask your questions directly. And so what you would need to do is, turn on your video so I can see you, and then wave at me. I'll put everything on gallery view so I can see everyone. And if I see you waving, I'll call on you, and you can then unmute your mic and present your question or comment directly to Steve. So who would like to start off? David Rouse. All right. You get the first question.
Yes. I organized what I think was the teach-in at the smallest
I'm so sorry. I forgot
educational institution.
Yeah.
The University of Virginia's college at at Clive, which used to be Clinch Valley College. And I probably got away with it because Nelson Lichtenstein and Richard Rorty were then at Charlottesville.
Right.
And Charlottesville wasn't going to insult the two best scholars it had at the time. They both, of course, very soon left. Lichtenstein went, I think, to Santa Barbara, and Rorty to Stanford.
Right.
But I think you very accurately described the kind of aftermath of those teach-ins. It got a tremendous amount of attention at the time. I got a call from Japan about the teach-in we had at UVA-Wise. But the labor has declined significantly. And of course, we're in the coal fields. And the United Mine Workers has seriously declined. Rich reached its pinnacle with the piston strike and then went with the AFL-CIO. United Mine Workers have been declining ever since. There was talk of their joining the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union, and I got to ask Rich about that, and he said that the staff sabotaged the negotiations. So you're absolutely right. There are troubles in the labor union, and we're seeing the corporatization of higher education simultaneously. And those two things, I think, have been disastrous.
Yeah. I'd say I should mention, first of all, how could I have forgotten that night we announced from the podium that 10 other teach-ins were happening simultaneously all over the country. Clinch Valley was one, at a little place, and then there was University of Texas in El Paso, and all kinds of, there were 10, and in the end there were 30 colleges, from Brown University to Philadelphia Community College, who participated either that night or in the ensuing year or two afterwards. And I meant to say that we were so excited. In fact, Clinch Valley was the first school I mentioned because I knew no one had ever heard of it, and it would be so exciting to people to know that it was coming from West Virginia. Yeah. Anyway, the unions, look, even at the time the teach-in happened, the unions, which had once represented roughly a third of the labor force, were down to a sixth. And in the private sector, down to 10%. And of course, now they're down to 6% in the private sector. So that dying away has continued. And that's the axiomatic basis of an alliance like sausage. And without it, you just don't, you can't have it, I don't think. But one thing that is interesting to me, I wanted to say this at the time, is that left intellectuals, liberal, have looked to the labor movement as, and rightly, as an engine that can buoy up everybody, and waited for that to happen or helped it happen. But what's interesting that happened very recently is that the labor movement is very close to dead. And yet there has been exactly the kind of political revolution that many leftist liberal intellectuals have been hoping for a long time. The Sanders phenomenon took everybody by surprise. Nobody thought that was going to happen. And yet it happened more or less in the absence of an organized labor movement, or one so weak. Obviously, certain unions supported Sanders and a lot did not, which was shameful in my opinion. But in any event, without a kind of robust labor movement in a national way, and yet you get this political revolution, which I think in the American past, you might have said can't happen unless there's a kind of militant labor surge happening. So it's an interesting kind of, I don't know what, inconsistency with what we've believed in the past. I'm hopeful for that reason. Young people identify with the Sanders movement, obviously in great numbers and disproportionate numbers for a lot of reasons, but not so much. They're a sympathy for working people, but not for an organized labor movement. I mean, they're antipathetic. They're not. They're pro-union, but that's not what's driving the sentiment.
Okay, Donna.
Thanks so much. Hello, thank you, Steve, and thank you so much to the Center for Global Justice for putting this conversation together. I wanted us to look forward for a minute. After I say one historical thing, which is Happy International Women's Day to
Right.
all of us. There's no small dose of support from the labor movement historically. But looking forward, given the slightly undermined, to put it mildly, position of the labor movement at this time, it doesn't really eviscerate its role. It doesn't have to. And I wondered what you thought about the ongoing role for labor in intersectional alliances with the Black rights movement, the immigrant rights movement, the women's movement, the environmental justice movement, and so many more. Whether those kinds of formations can give new life to the purposes that the labor movement once bore largely on its own shoulders.
Well, clearly I would hope so. Do I think so? I don't know. That's where the hope lies. One of the exciting things for us back 25 years ago was that this new leadership of the AFL seemed to be opening itself up to precisely those kinds of alliances. That was, I would say, 90% of the reason we thought, oh, if it had just been a new president of the AFL, it wouldn't have mattered to us. It was that their outreach, their openness, their recognition of their own narrowness and parochialism and their failure to address these populations and to welcome them that excited us. Yes, of course, I think this is the hope of a labor movement, but I can't say I'm optimistic. I would like to be, but I'm not. We're living through really dark times. There are these movements on the ground, which are always good to see. And I should say, of course, there are a lot of labor movements happening today, which are not within the confines of the organized labor movement. They were even happening in 1996. There were worker centers and other kinds of things going on then. And the teaching didn't happen immaculately. And I obviously welcome them, but I think, I spent a lot of time writing history, trying to figure out why. Two questions have always troubled me. Why do people not rebel all the time when they're treated with such indignity and oppression and exploitation and inequality? Why not? And then I asked the other question, why do they ever rebel? Because it's so dangerous. You put everything on the line. It's not a comfortable position to be in, not only your livelihood, but your life. And so, and all the psychological internalizing of kind of deference and subordination to institutions of authority and people in authority. And I don't know the answer, but it happens kind of unexpectedly. Sometimes it happens in good times and sometimes it happens in bad times. I don't really know. I think, like I was saying, why didn't it happen in 1996? All the ingredients seem to be there. This grossly unequal society, this racist society, this homophobic society, and there were little things happening, but nothing happened. Now, much more is happening, and I do take heart from that, but I don't know how far it will go and how to inject the labor question back into a central place in our public life. I think it needs to be, and maybe it will. The gig economy is producing a kind of advanced or extreme sense of insecurity and anxiety and lousy lives, and so that the notion of exploitation can converge on the question of equality. And together, those two questions are very, very powerful, I think, in a movement.
For those who are watching on YouTube, let me remind you that you can get your question or comment to us by sending an email to this email address. Let me put forth a point for your discussion. The 90s, the Clinton years, was the year of growing neoliberalism. That became the common sense framework of political and economic thought. Capitalism was undergoing major transformation with its globalization, and that had a lot to do with weakening the labor movement as jobs moved abroad, and even those that didn't, workers had to give back hard-won gains in hopes of being able to keep their jobs in the U.S. And the Democratic Party basically was abandoning the working class at a time when, in fact, there was very low class consciousness among workers. So, as great as your hopes were for for being able to form a progressive labor intellectual alliance, maybe Fukuyama was right that it was the end of an era of history, at least, and
Well, I tell
capitalism moving into a new neoliberal global order.
Yeah, I think in that sense, he was right, and he would remain right for quite some time. And I think the abandonment, the role of the Democratic Party was very instrumental in making that happen. They abandoned what was left of, and there wasn't that much left of their New Deal heritage. The Democratic Leadership Council, which Clinton ran before he became president, did its very best to bury those New Deal-oriented circles in the Democratic Party, and they were very effective at doing that. So there was a kind of bipartisan persuasion about globalization, free trade, NAFTA. Look, one of the things that happens, there are signs of restiveness, which are are foreboding that happened in the 90s. You have the Ross Perot campaign in 92 and again in 96. This is a fissure. It's a fissure which is saying to people, but the Democratic Party is not prepared to, in fact, quite the contrary, to take advantage of it anymore, that there are working people out there who are really worried about what's going on, and they're worried about NAFTA. And Perot does very well in 92, not so well in 96, but as an independent candidate, which in America you don't do very well usually as a third party candidate. And he does so for a number of reasons, but one of them is he tells people soon you're going to hear a sucking sound and it's going to be the flow of jobs south of the border to Mexico. And Clinton does NAFTA and everybody hears the sucking sound. But the Democratic Party has authored that, has abandoned their blue collar base. And you have the Buchanan fissure in the Republican Party, which tells you even within, and we see, these are premonitions of what we're living through today. The Buchanan shows up at the 96 Republican Party convention and scandalizes everybody by, now it wouldn't be a scandal, but then it was. He's denouncing aliens and immigrants. He's denouncing free trade, which of course the GOP is as much for or more so than Clinton and the Democrats. He's talking about keeping out foreigners and that kind of thing. And that the Republican Party isn't adequately defending the cultural interests of ordinary people, about family and religion and so on. And he's a scandal then. But we're living through subsequent iterations of that fissuring, which the Democratic Party has consistently ignored for all this time. So they're complicit in what happened, and willingly so, because they're advocates of this free market liberalism, and unions are not about the free market. They interfere by their nature with the free market. That's why they exist, and neoliberal orthodoxy doesn't like that. That's right. And I think the thing is, we all have our different views about what's going on today in the Republican Party, but to some degree, I think that to the degree the Republican Party has had an organ transplant and its heart is somewhere else, and now it so incongruously represents some significant segment of the white blue-collar class. That's an astonishing development, which was in the making for a long time and which the Democratic Party ignored. Is it purely a racist phenomenon? I don't think so. Obviously, there's racist and xenophobic elements in that movement, but those things, they are mixed with other kinds of things, a kind of anti-establishment stuff, which is tied to free trade and deindustrialization and the decline in their standard of living. It's important to remember, I think, in looking at our landscape, our political and social landscape today, that you have people who voted for Obama, white people I'm talking about, white working people who voted for Obama twice and then voted for Trump. And so I'm not saying these people are not racist, but clearly there were other things on their mind when they voted for a black man for president. And during, I remember this very well, during the 2016 primaries, when Bernie was running against Hillary, there were a lot of working class types out there, and you could see this in the results of the primary season this past season, who were trying to decide, should I vote for Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump in the primary? That is to say, there's a kind of social restiveness out there which can move in. Some is Proud Boys. That's not going. That's, forget that. And other elements. That's not happening for us. That's in a molecular way fascist. And if it grows and becomes more widespread, it will become a fascist party. But I'm talking about the other millions and millions of people who had grievances about the establishment, the bipartisan elite for a long time, that the Democratic Party ignored.
Agree.
Mm-hmm. Well, that restlessness, bipartisan in character, reflected, I think, a basic sense of having been betrayed by the political class.
Yeah.
With NAFTA and other free trade agreements and other, neoliberal policies supported by Republicans and Democratic parties alike, ordinary working people felt that they had been abandoned, betrayed by the political elite. And so, as Michael Moore put it back in 2016, they just wanted to throw a hand grenade into the political establishment, and did that in 2016 and did it again in 2020. Although by that time there were some at least that said, "Well, God, it's getting worse. We at least have to try to save things by putting the neoliberal democratic establishment back in."
Return to some kind of normalcy.
Yeah,
Right. And
but it's a kind of a desperation.
the
The
desperation.
left has not been able to offer an alternative.
Yeah, I agree. These people were Hillary's deplorables. And without her ever even saying that, they knew she thought of them as deplorable. And that's the problem with this, that Democratic Party neoliberal elite, that they are divorced from that world, don't know how to connect to it anymore.
David.
Yes, how much of that can be traced back to the DLC, Democratic Leadership Conference, and Clinton, Al Gore, Sam Nunn, all Southerners, redefined the Democratic Party in light of McGovern's defeat, and opened up the South for non-labor economic development, brought more Southerners into government. They then also gave space for the Republicans to take over the South.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's why I alluded to he ran the DLC, Clinton did, before he became president. And of course, these other people too. And they've been at the, look, the Reagan victory alarmed these elite circles in the Democratic Party. And they said, how do we ape that? How do we become this kind of alternative neoliberal thing? Let's shed all the social welfare stuff, the labor stuff, everything that identifies us with the New Deal and big government. Remember Reagan's famous thing, the government is not the solution, it's the problem. And they heard that and they see him win and they say, let's get rid of that. And then they become very tight with Wall Street and the leading financial interests that are pro-free trade all over the world. So they build alliances in that direction. And I think you're right.
Do you think that maybe there's some sign of a reversal of that attitude about big government? People recognizing much more now that we need big government.
I hope so.
At the pandemic, to get the economy up and running again, people are much more receptive to big government in principle. And in concrete terms, maybe there's an opportunity for the left there to promote the expansion of social programs.
I think so. I don't know. I hope so. The pandemic is obviously the big opening that you can walk right through because everybody wants it. What it really puzzles me, quite frankly, I guess it's Trump's political, tactical influence that produces this result. But I was really surprised, maybe it's naive of me, that the Republicans voted in lockstep against the relief package. Their people want this. This politically, it's like the Democrats. It's a political class in the Republican Party divorced from a lot of its new base when it comes to this kind of a question. These people, I'm sure the polls all show that everybody wants relief of some kind or another. I don't think those people are going to give a good goddamn about how the budget deficit. They want help. And it is a door. And I don't know why, quite frankly, maybe it's stupid of me that these Republicans didn't break ranks and vote for it. And I hope they have to pay a heavy cost for that. And I think it is an opening for the Democratic Party, also because the pandemic has exposed the ugly social and economic inequalities that have been rampant in American society for a long time. And other things have made them visible, but the pandemic has made them really impossible to ignore. everything about it, who's hurt, who's helped, who's not, who gets the vaccine, who doesn't, who gets sick, who dies, who has a job, who doesn't have a job. If you're on the right side of the pandemic, you not only get inoculated, you can make money. If you're on the wrong side of the pandemic, you don't make money, you may die. So this is a big opportunity. I don't know what's going to happen. Biden is he's part of that. He may be lunch pail Joe, but he's part of that neoliberal world inside the Democratic Party. He's tactically in a difficult situation. I think he's temperamentally apt to retreat without much resistance. I think the pandemic relief package was an open door which he could walk through. Well, I guess he couldn't have if he didn't have that slim majority, but I feel he did, and it's a good package. But after all, the biggest relief package was signed by Donald Trump. So that, which is another reason I'm puzzled about the Republican Party. These people want that relief package. I'm made nervous by the retreat on the minimum wage. I'm made nervous by the concessions on various kinds of things. But by and large, it's good. And I think he feels that there's a welcoming world out there for this relief package and therefore for bigger government, for the government to play the role it's supposed to play.
I've been observing our political science friend, Harry Targ, who looks very thoughtful. He's been pondering all of this. You want to share your thoughts with us?
You're always picking on me. Well, I had a couple of comments and then a question. I remember over the years since 1996, there's viable academic organizations that presume to be allied with labor. There's the Working Class Studies Association. There have been vibrant labor studies programs in several states. I was peripherally involved in one in Indiana that was a really exciting program with labor studies courses offered at a variety of branches of Indiana University, and labor studies faculty who would pick up and go and do short courses at union halls. And as long as the labor and the Democrats had some influence in the state legislature, these labor studies programs were funded, well funded. And over the last several years in several states, including Indiana, the funding dissipated, but they were vibrant. And there was a professional association of labor educators that still exists, UALE, United Association of Labor Educators. So, I wonder if to some degree, this vibrancy continued after 1996. And I have a kind of Hoosier chauvinist bias that what you described, Steve, was a teach-in of intellectuals from the Northeast. It was good to hear there were several teach-ins, but I wonder if that sometimes is part of the problem. I also remember in the late 90s, significant solidarity with the Zapatistas, the battle for Seattle. There were still movements, and intellectuals allied with labor seemed to be involved in these. So these are just some of my remembrances. The question I have that I think is maybe more interesting is if the nature of class is changing in the 21st century, and it's being reflected in new kind of trade unionism. And I'm thinking particularly of teachers' unions. And I read Eric Blank's book, what is it, Red State? I forgot, but it's a case history of teacher organizing in West Virginia, Oklahoma, and Arizona, 3 red states. And part of what he describes is teachers realizing that in fact they were workers and should have some affinity for the tradition of trade union struggles in their own states. and you have within the teachers sort of the embodiment of both the intellectual and the worker. So I wonder what you think about the prospects for organizing among teachers. And of course, we're seeing it a little bit in higher education as well. AAUP is beginning to grow. In a few places, faculty have joined more traditional unions. So I wonder if there's enough to uptick, and part of it has to do with the changing nature of what it means to be a worker in 21st century America.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Yes, of course, it goes to my perennial long-term question about when do people revolt? Why do they not? The teacher strikes were stunning because they were happening in the most improbable places. They were happening in states entirely Republican dominated, very anti-labor places, right to work states, where teachers had really barely any right to organize, no strike laws were in effect. I actually wrote an article about this. So it was totally unexpected and enormously heartening, and suggests just what you're saying, that, to pardon the expression, the proletarianization of public employees generally, not just teachers, has had, and of course, public sector unions has been the one bright spot in the labor movement for a long time, even as the private sector has dwindled and dwindled. So yes, I very much think that's an enormously hopeful sign. It also, why I alluded to the kind of transformation of academic work life into one that has become increasingly, already by 1996, I forget the statistic, the growth in non-tenure track adjunct labor was already well advanced. It's much more advanced now. You get all these attempts by both graduate students and adjunct people to organize all over the country at elite universities and non-elite universities. And I think that is what you say. It's a kind of change in who we expect to be the working class. And that this working class is often maybe more highly educated, I would say, in terms of advanced education. It may be technically sophisticated. The gig economy is often, and techies are organizing now, as well as gig workers of various kinds, because they're beginning to see themselves, even at places like Facebook and so on, beginning to see themselves as workers and adopt that identity as a way of defending themselves. So yeah, I think that's one of the encouraging signs. I should have said, you're quite right about these labor research centers. I was, after the teaching, became associated with what used to be known as well, it's now called the School for Labor and Urban Studies at CUNY, at the City University of New York. But that began as the Queens College Labor Resource Center. And that grew tremendously after the teach-in. It actually started a journal, which maybe some of you are familiar with, called New Labor Forum, as a consequence of the teach-in. Another journal that grew up for the same purposes, called Working USA, was an outgrowth of the teach-in. And even before the teach-in, these centers were producing reports, research, and lending their support in, as you say, what used to be, in your case, pro-labor states. New York was able to hold on because the presence of the labor movement remains, relatively speaking, more powerful than it any longer is in a place like Indiana. So the budgets are still there. They still have some political clout in Albany. They're able to fund these things at a better level. So they're important, and they go on. But yeah, I do think we have to come to terms with not only the change in the complexion of the labor force in terms of people of color and women, but also in where this proletarianization process is happening, and where therefore there might be signs of resistance, have been obviously signs of great resistance.
Robert Mueller has his hand up.
Hi, Steve. Hi, everybody. For there to be masses of people in motion, it seems like you've got to have a strong and obvious motivational basis, which in the end will boil down to fear. Okay, not being able to have a job, not being able to have a future, and also there needs to be the power of aspiration, that what you're heading to is someplace better, or you have the chance of heading to someplace better if you're willing to engage in some battle, some activity to do that. But on the way, there has to be a way of thinking about yourself individually and as part of the mass, which in this country has been, in practical terms, eliminated. Nobody wants to be working class. I mean, the middle class, or the working people of the country, another euphemism. If you say working class in this country, you're automatically a revolutionary, right? I mean, you're automatically something negative, okay? The only people who talk about class or working class in this country are Republicans warning off about class war, okay? That the Democrats are trying to start class war. So the question that I have for you, Steve, or for everybody, for myself, is how do you obtain a consciousness of yourself as part of some larger movement if you're denied, or you deny yourself the classical notion, the very substantial notion of being part of a class that's being oppressed? That's really the key question. In other words, the left has completely lost control of the language.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, and it's a puzzle and one very, very difficult to solve. But I'm going to disagree a little bit. What you said about class being a verboten term, except for Republicans warning about class warfare, has largely been true up until the recent past. Bernie Sanders changed that, and it's part of what made the Sanders phenomenon so extraordinary. Came out of nowhere, but he talks all the time about the working class, all the time. And his influence in the Democratic Party and outside of the Democratic Party has, look, we're not talking about imminent revolution, but we are talking about a culture which has become somewhat more used to thinking of the working class as a body of people who are being treated badly in Sanders' terms, who are being denied this and that, who don't have a voice in public life, and so on. That's a start. It's better than it was before Bernie Sanders. And I think it's important how that happens. Do you need a Bernie Sanders to gestate that, to make that happen? I don't know. You know, fear cuts both ways. Fear can make you passive, or it can drive you forward. You're right that what we need to have, and the only way you get this is in social bodies. You have to have a perspective that life can be better and different. And this is what has always characterized the great upheavals in American life. Even in the 19th century, the movements, whether they were the labor movement, the Knights of Labor, or the antitrust movement, or the populist movement, or the many other, the socialist movement, all had a notion that they were anti-capitalist, that there was some way of life better, different than the capitalism which had descended upon them and was ruining their lives. And by the time we get to my Greenwich Village heroes in the turn of the century, we're talking about socialism. That's what is, everybody from President Woodrow Wilson to Lenin is acknowledging that the labor question is the burning question that the world has to face. Lenin has a different solution to that question than Woodrow Wilson, but it's a moment when the labor question captivated the imagination and the movements, whether they were the Socialist Party or the Industrial Workers of the World or the anarchist movement, at least elements of it. I don't know. I think what we have to understand, what I theorize, is that question was resolved in a way by the New Deal, in a way that is now no longer viable. That is to say, by consumer capitalism. The New Deal introduced elements of industrial democracy in the welfare state, better than what had existed before that time. They were compelled by an upsurge in the labor movement to grant those rights, the right to organize, the right to form a union, Social Security, unemployment insurance, would not have happened without this mass upwelling of the movement. It's that mass movement, however, I'll give you an example of this, which changes people's consciousness. It's chicken and egg. How do you get the mass movement to begin with? But during the Flint sit-down strike in 1937 against General Motors, there's a wonderful book. Anyway, one of the workers who was involved in organizing is interviewed about his experience during the sit-down strike. And what he says to the interviewer is that his courage, his insouciance in the face of authority, which had always intimidated him, whether it was on the shop floor or the management or whatever, the police, the judges that had sent people like him to jail if they acted up. What had changed was, he said, it was the CIO speaking in me. That is to say, what his consciousness had changed because he had this identity with this larger collective. He was no longer an individual. And that speaks to your question about the middle class. The middle class aspiration depends upon a deep individualism, that the way one is going to progress in this society is through more or less individual pursuit, self-reliance, enterprise, innovation, and that you're at war with the rest of society. You're competing, and if you compete well, you will do well, and devil take the hindmost. That's the ethos. And what this CIO guy was saying was he began to see the world differently because he was in this ensemble, this kind of a new social situation. How you create that, I'm not sure.
Okay, David is forming a thought.
How much of the enthusiasm, and I'm using that word with a bit of literalness, that used to motivate the labor movement has now been diverted into evangelical Christianity?
Well, that's a tough one. I don't think I even have the faintest idea. I mean, I think, yeah, sometimes this is a dangerous thing to say, but movements, whether they're secular or not, promise transcendence. The socialist movement promised transcendence, a secular transcendence. That's why it was able for a time, even in America and much more in a much more muscular way, other places in the world, to generate that kind of enthusiasm and excitement that you're talking about. That can become very mystical. It can become supernatural, or it can remain grounded in the possibilities of the historical context and moment. Whether or not evangelical Christianity, look, it's I think of the growth of evangelical Christianity in America as another one of the great mysteries. We're all secularists, I assume, whether we are, it doesn't matter. The secular narrative went like this. The country is inevitably, inexorably has already become more and more secular and will forever do that. That's what modern life is about. That's what modern industry is about. That's what modern bureaucratic organization is about. It's the end of the sacred. It's the end of the sacred. And religion is an atavism. It will die away. Well, obviously, that didn't happen. And the opposite happened. And maybe that's because the secular had given up. Daniel Bell, who's a man of great intelligence and wrote books I liked and ones I didn't, once talked about the secular sacred. He wrote an article about that. And I've often thought to myself, that's what the great social movements have been able to imbue in people, a something sacred about moral values that a secular movement can realize. Whether that's brotherhood, let's be Christian about the brotherhood of men, about commonality, about the common good, which Betty Friedan talked about that night at the teach-in. So some of that, when you don't find it in secular society anymore, when you find it absent from the political universe, when the political universe becomes not just corrupt is not really the problem, it's utterly self-seeking. It may talk about the public good, it has no use for the public good. And you see that every day in the behavior of politicians and the political parties. And if the evangelical movement, and on top of that, produces a brotherhood and a social welfare brotherhood, which it certainly can do, and that has real material social welfare benefits, maybe that's part of the connection. I don't know.
I have a question. Oops, I have a question.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Here in San Miguel. I retired a few years ago from teaching at Cooper Union in New York, and I was the founding president of the Union for Part-Time Faculty. I wasn't an adjunct. I was a little less contingent, which is why, and I knew I was going to retire soon, so I could be pretty, what shall we say, bold. But so I think I would say about that, and the question of people recognizing themselves as working class and so on, and wanting some better way of life, or at least some better way of work life. I'll confine it to that for the perspective, and then actual members of the union I led. They knew that everybody, all the faculty members, all the part-time faculty members, there are several different categories of them, not just adjuncts. Some had more, were more attached, just long-term appointments and so on. They knew things should be better, but they were very skeptical about whether the union would be able to make them better. I mean, that was the problem. It wasn't that they were happy being exploited and not having health insurance. And actually, that's one reason I was very determined to be the first president, so that I could be, I had no problem being a hard negotiator with the administration. I mean, I had nothing to lose. So I, tried my best before I retired to show that the union could do things for people. And that made a big difference. But I also, I wanted to sort of link that to what Steve was saying about noticing changes, or that there are changes in the working class. There are, I think, excuse me if I'm misquoting, but there are more, the larger number of people of color, women, have changed the complexion of the working class. And you could maybe also say the incredibly increased number of contingent university faculty, something like 75% of all faculty across the nation, have also changed it. But well, except maybe for the addition of the adjunct faculty, the contingent faculty members. Isn't it the case that people of color and women have always been within the bounds of what the traditional leftist labor allied movement has called the working class? It's just that they were not so foregrounded. They were not so noticed. I don't think they all came in, in the 90s. And I would just, the whole, I guess I'm trying to sort of undermine this whole notion that there is a definitive working class. Somebody said something about who we expect to be the working class. Well, why should you expect anybody in particular to be the working class? Of course, it's always changing. And isn't that the job of the leftists to notice, or the labor allied left, to notice who happens to be structurally working class, and to find ways to unite them, to advocate for themselves, and to advocate on behalf of them. There isn't a working class that's already there, and sort of dropping people into it. So I guess if that's a question, that's my question. Thanks.
Oh, I agree with your question. Just to clarify one thing, I think there was, beginning with the shift in the weight of the service sector and the retail sector and the entertainment sector as more the dominant sectors of the economy, a shift in the composition of the labor force, so that it became more female and also more people of color. And as it became a more low wage, as low wage sectors of the economy grew at the expense, it became. But of course, the working class has always included women, and they're some of the first unionists. They found the big garment unions. I've written about the garment unions. And people of color do as well. The difference was that the union movement in 1996, when the teach-in was happening, didn't reflect that at all. It was still a predominantly white male membership. And this is what Sweeney and his folks recognized, and that if they were going to get serious about doing the one essential thing, which is to organize the unorganized, it also meant being opening the doors to women and people of color, against which, a lot of, look, I mean, unions, like you say, people say, what is the union going to do for me? The unions have had a long history of being corrupt or prejudiced or being all white, having all white locals, and it goes back a long way. So they had to break all of that down. I do think that the change in the labor force and its composition, the kinds of people that are in it, is vitally important, and that the labor movement has been catching up, recognizing that maybe more belatedly than they might have.
Yeah. Better hurry up.
Time is running out. I do feel that we're in dark times, and there are real threatening. I mean, this is pretty unique in American history to face the kind of I don't know how to describe it, grassroots, rebellious, anti-elitist, but frighteningly right-wing and potentially fascist movement of some size. I'm not so concerned about the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers. It's the larger population that might not storm the Capitol. I really think of that as despite all the histrionics, not really an insurrection or anything. It's kind of an deadly opera buffet, but there's a larger thing going on that is frightening. And unless we do something major and fast, it's going to be, and look, the history of every fascist movement that I know anything about has always included demoralized parts of working classes. It did in Germany. It did in Italy. I mean, after all, Mussolini is a socialist. There was a whole wing of the Nazi Party that had its roots for a period of time in the late 20s and early 30s. The communists and Nazis not only fought in the streets, they also swapped members. I don't mean deliberately, but membership would cross from the Nazi Party to the Communist Party and back from the Communist Party or Socialist Party to the Nazi Party. So we're going to reckon with this and figure out how we're going to answer it.
Well, I don't think that very many Black people are part of those groups you're worried about. And I can't see why. I'm not sure what you meant by the labor question versus the equality question, but I mean, obviously the place to raise awareness is among Black Americans who need to be further recognized. I mean, that's what Black Lives Matter is all about. That's what it says.
I agree. What I'm saying is I think it's also the burden and the mission of the labor movement to raise that consciousness among others as well, who have suffered their own long, slow deindustrialization decline and have legitimate grievances and can be reached. At least my hope that they can be.
Well, Black people in Chicago, Black people suffered the first deindustrialization decline, and then it spread to others. I mean,
that's true.
Commonality. Sorry for interrupting. I'm sorry.
No,
Shut up now.
Yeah, collective political action, I think, rests upon a collective identity that is identifying with some larger group, and the working class is not serving in that way now. A very low level of class consciousness in that sense. The kind of collective identities that we see moving social action are well, we see it in social movements like Black Lives Matter, based upon a racial identity. There's even Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez does not use Bernie uses the term working class, but she does not. She talks about ordinary people.
Yeah.
It's a different designation, a non-class designation, but it's one that people can relate to. Ordinary people. It's very, very encompassing and politically quite effective.
I think that's
the whole climate change movement, the issues around gentrification rooted in communities rather than in workplaces. Those are the kinds of issues that, and the women's movement, of course. We should not forget that, this being International Women's Day. We have these kinds of identities and issues that are located in other aspects of people's lives, not in their workplace, that seem to be what is generating social movements today.
May I say that just as you spoke of Black Lives Matter, you said it was rooted, I believe you said it was rooted in racial identity. Couldn't we say it's rooted in structural racism? I mean, I think many people in Black Lives Matter have a much larger political worldview and consciousness than, to be tied the way that identity politics tends to tie you. They're perfectly clear that what's happening to them is structural, and it's happening to lots of other people too. But they're bringing forward the Black lives that matter in this case, since they feel no one else was.
Mhm.
I mean, and the same with what we were saying later. I mean, even gentrification is a kind of structural exploitation. So that's the commonality.
Yeah, these all of these social movements have the potential, or if not already explicitly, anti-capitalist. In that sense, they serve the kind of oppositional function that the class-based identities used to.
Cliff, I'm going to have to leave. Sorry, I didn't know how long this was going to go.
Yeah, we've already gone past our designated end time.
Thank you very, very much. I really enjoyed this. And
Yeah.
thanks everybody for
Thank you.
participating.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
a big thanks to Steve for a very provocative presentation, and thank the audience for your participation. Hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. Let me just call your attention to the fact that next week we're, as part of Women's History Month, we are joining in sponsoring a webinar on human trafficking today. We're doing that with Sarah Mohair, which is a women's organization in San Miguel. We have actually 3 events we are jointly sponsoring with them. And let me also point out that Sarah Mohair, in about 20 minutes, will be having a women's concert, which of Mexican women performers in San Miguel. You can access that from our website, globaljusticecenter.org.
Cliff, are they performing live as well?
Yes, this is a live performance.
Okay, somewhere in San Miguel.
But well, by Zoom. It's live.
Okay, thanks. That's
live
what I
on
wanted to
Zoom.
Gotcha.
Not in person.
Gotcha. Thank you.
But well, I want to go out with a little music that is appropriate for the occasion, and okay. See if I can get this going.
Inspiration through the workers' blood shall run. There can be no power greater anywhere beneath the sun. Yet what force on earth is weaker than the feeble strength of one? But the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union may. It is we who plowed the prairie, built the cities where they trade, dug the mines and built the workshops, endless miles of railroad laid. Now we stand outcast and starving mid the wonders we have made, but the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever, solidarity forever, solidarity forever, for the union makes us strong. They have taken untold millions that they never toiled to earn, but without our brain and muscle, not a single wheel can turn. We can break their haughty power, gain our freedom when we learn that the union makes us strong. In our hands is placed a power greater than their hoarded gold, greater than the might of atoms, magnified 1,000-fold. We can bring to birth a new world from the ashes of the old, for the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever, solidarity forever, solidarity forever, for the union makes us strong.
Very good.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And let me just in parting, give thanks to the team that helped put this and other webinars together, including Gregory. Oop.
Can't stop him.
There's working class militancy coming in. No, I want to thank Gregory Diamant, Liz Mestras, Roberto Robles, Olivia Canales. They're our team that put these together. And thank you again. This is Cliff Duran now signing off.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.